All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are doing another show this week. This Thursday, Peter and I did a reading of a creationist book from the late 1960s, which, as Peter pointed out, contains all the cutting-edge creationist arguments. And so, yep, all the latest creationist arguments. So, today we are, in theory, finishing the Cretaceous and maybe starting the Cenozoic. So we'll finish the Mesozoic.
If we survive the Cretaceous.
We may or we may not. It's possible. So
not an easy thing to survive.
That's true. It wiped out, what was it, 70% of all terrestrial fauna or something like that?
I think it's like second to the Great Dying in terms of like Phanerozoic extinction events.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. That's what happens when a big rock hits your nice, warm little planet. Things go bad. They go boom.
Yeah, they do go boom.
And so we have the one, the only, the theropod, the myth, the legend, Dapper Dinosaur. Welcome.
That's me. Of course, the most frequent guest on this channel at this point, although still not in the intro.
Oh my god, I should have said it before you said something, but I was a fool.
I mean, at this point, it's just a meme now.
Richard Dawkins would be proud. All right.
I hear he hates that word has caught off the way it has.
That's really sad because, that's going to be his legacy.
I know.
I mean,
years from now, people will still remember him for inventing the word meme.
I mean, the selfish gene is cool and all, but he literally invented the concept of the meme. That will be his legacy. So. All right. So, we ready to jump back into the Cretaceous?
Absolutely.
All right. I will hand things over to you.
All right. Well, so we're talking about Cope's rule. Earlier, we had been talking about some island dwarfism and island gigantism in the Mesozoic, because this is something we see today, but it's also something we see in the past. So the idea is smaller animals tend to get larger on islands, while larger animals tend to get smaller. The applicability of this rule has been debated. It seems to apply to certain mammals, canids, ursids, certain rodents, artiodactyls, proboscideans, but not others. So this is a rule in terms of it's a broad tendency. Now, the explanation for this is basically, so if you're a really big animal, like you see that mammoth right there, well, it takes a lot of calories to maintain such a large body. And islands tend to have very limited resources in terms of calories available for all niches. And so if you can reproduce a similar number of offspring at a similar rate, we'll say, while needing fewer calories, well, you're more likely to live long enough to reproduce more. And so you tend to get shrinking of very large animals. So I believe before, Jackson, we saw a dwarf sauropod from an island, right?
Yes, we saw Magyarosaurus, the dwarf titanosaur from, what is today Romania, but was in the late Cretaceous Hateg Island.
Yes, which, by the way, Hateg Island is really cool. Lots of weird island stuff going on there. Now, the reverse, where small animals tend to get larger, if you're a tiny animal, like let's say a pigeon, and you happen to find yourself on an island, chances are that you can feed yourself pretty well at a small size, and so you're not going to necessarily be calorie restricted. However, islands often have a relative lack of large-bodied predators, which means you're really not at risk for predation. And so you don't have to run away and scurry away and try to, protect your life quite as much. So you might turn into a large flightless dodo over the course of a few million years, which is in fact how the dodo came about. It's actually a kind of dove, which was only recently discovered on the basis of genetic sequencing, because it doesn't look much like a dove. And so you get on islands these very strange sort of experimental evolutionary melting pots where you get tiny, what would otherwise be macrofauna, and you get gigantic scale, what would otherwise be, little tiny animals. Also, while it doesn't seem to have happened much in terms of like pterosaurs or anything, because we don't know of any flightless pterosaurs, birds often become flightless on islands. And actually, even some New Zealand bats are more terrestrial than is typical for bats. They spend way more time on the ground or climbing things than they do flying, which is unusual for bats. Bats usually they fly everywhere. So, can see that tend. Islands are weird, but I think that probably covers it for this slide.
I just wanted to point out for the Myotragus Balearicus from the Balearic Islands, which I believe are near Spain. These little guys are goats, and their eyes move from the sides of their head to the front because over the course of a few million years, because as Dapper pointed out, there are very few large carnivores on islands, and so without predators, they didn't need that sort of panoptic vision. And so their eyes move back to the front. It was very unusual for goats.
It's very creepy too.
Yeah, it looks like something who would give you 3 riddles.
You know what? New D&D race is going to drop Myotragus goat people.
I'm here for it. Yep.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Yep. Sorry. Okay. Oh, we're continuing with Cope's rule. See, I have seen these before, but it's been a while, and I am lazy, so I didn't do a refresher on the slides. Hadtag Island in present-day Romania. The insularity of the island is inferred from a combination of dwarf and primitive dinosaur taxa, Titanosaur, Mesozoic, Ankylosaur, Struthiosaurus, and Hadrosaur, Telmatosaurus. Naming an Ankylosaur Struthiosaurus, which means ostrich lizard, is really weird.
Yeah, I don't remember offhand like what aspect of the morphology they were like, yeah, this looks like an ostrich.
Right? I mean, it's pictured. It doesn't exactly scream ostrich to me.
Yeah.
Whereas Struthiomimus is also a dinosaur that does look like an ostrich. So let's see. Non-dinosaur fauna of the island include giraffe-sized pterosaur Hadrosauridae. An interesting thing about Hadrosauridae is that it's part of the Azhdarchoidea, which are the group of animals that also includes Quetzalcoatlus, the largest known animal to have ever flown. And the thing that's interesting about that is that they can get around on islands just fine, these flying animals. And so when you have a group of islands that are relatively close to a mainland or just a big, long archipelago, the flying animals tend not to be affected by things like Cope's Law because they can just leave. They essentially don't treat islands as if they were islands because of their increased mobility. Islands have to be pretty far away from any mainland in order to have the flying animals that end up there be stuck.
I think it's usually like 300 miles. I think is like the typical considered like oceanic islands. So
that may well be. I will not pretend to know the number there.
The reason, so the I included those dinosaurs up there. So Magyarosaurus and Struthiosaurus are dwarves compared to the mainland. They're closest relatives on the mainland. And Telmatosaurus is a hadrosauroid, so it's a very basal hadrosaur relative. It is in some ways more like Iguanodontians, which are the ancestors of hadrosaurs. And so an interesting thing is a lot of times very primitive or very basally derived animals and plants and things will end up on islands because while everything else is sort of evolving in lockstep on the mainland, not everything is ending up on islands. So you get these little refuges where something primitive doesn't have to compete with anything advanced until humans by accident come and release like mice or something on the island, then everything's screwed.
Yeah, humans like to just randomly release very, very destructive organisms onto islands like mice, rats, weasels, snakes, cobras sometimes.
Cobras.
Why not?
Yeah. For anyone who's who didn't see it, that's a reference to the island of Sao Tome. So go watch our Process of Evolution series.
Yeah, where we talk about an island where someone just decided that, you know what this island needs? Deadly toxic snakes. That's what we're missing here. Like, okay, sure, buddy. Why?
You want to study fruit flies? You better step over some cobras.
Seriously. Man, humans do some dumb things sometimes.
Yeah.
Actually, in my
nutshell.
hometown, for several years, people were catching piranhas in the river.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, people were dumping their unwanted aquarium piranhas in the river.
Well, that's like the Everglades that has the freaking ball pythons and anacondas now and stuff like that.
And hepatitis macaques.
Nice.
Yeah. There's a whole population of macaques that have escaped from an island where they were being kept as a tourist attraction, and a large portion of them have hep C.
Oh my god.
Which, by the way, in macaques is usually asymptomatic, but is potentially lethal to humans.
Of course, because thanks, Florida.
Right. I think we can go on to the next slide, though.
Yeah.
Iguanodontia. Okay, so Iguanodontia is, it's got Iguanodon, which is like the second ever dinosaur in terms of human, like, formal description of. They are a group of ornithopods, and a lot of times people will mistake them for hadrosaurs, and that is because they are actually relatively closely related. Iguanodons are, generally speaking, a bit more primitive, and by primitive I just mean they have a more basal anatomy than hadrosaurs tend to. But they also have really cool thumb spikes, which is neat. Originally, when Iguanodon was discovered, it was thought the thumb spike was a nose spike, and so you can see statues of it in places like Crystal Palace over in the UK, where there's a big lizard animal with a spike on its nose, and that is in fact an Iguanodon, as you can see at the top left, which in fact looked almost nothing like that sculpture. I think the things that sculpture got right were 4 limbs and a tail. And that's about it. Everything else about that sculpture is wrong, but I still love the sculpture. But yeah, we have a few others, Monobotosaurus and Rhinosaurus. And Jackson, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Monobotosaurus a southern hemisphere animal?
Australia, yeah.
Australia? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the cool things about that is that the southern hemisphere has not been as well explored in terms of paleontology as the northern hemisphere. Part of that is just there's not many people there that live there, so it's harder to just get stuff done, right? But also because a lot of it has been politically unstable, is what I'm going to say mildly. So that's why one of the reasons why South America, like sub-Saharan Africa, are sort of not super well explored in terms of paleontology. And also, the people who first started doing paleontology as a systematic science where you're actually, taking notes and everything like that, that started in Europe. And it quickly went to North America, in the United States and Canada. So those are the places with the best studied fossil assemblages. So it's a combination of current and recent past politics and wars and whatnot. But yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot else about Iguanodontia.
Ugly German Truths, which is still one of my favorite name channel subscribers of all time, says, do you know the channel Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong?
I do. I've been following that guy since before that channel existed, back when he was on someone else's channel.
Nice. I think we follow each other on Twitter, but I don't think I watch his stuff. I probably should. His stuff pops up in my feed a lot, so I probably should. I just haven't yet.
It's fun stuff. In case anyone is watching this who doesn't know, Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong is basically a show where people send dinosaur toys to the host, whose name I don't remember, honestly. And he tells you what's wrong with them and what could be done to make them more accurate. And he's usually reasonably fair. Like, he'll say things like, look, at this scale, I can't expect you to reasonably indicate, like, feathering. But we should note that it exists. But, like, how would you note that in a toy that's, like, 2 inches tall? I don't know. Which is something I appreciate because, like, you got to be fair. Like, he did a novelty Velociraptor skeleton that was less than an inch tall. And he's like, yeah, I get why you only have 3 pairs of ribs. I'm not gonna knock it on that because this thing is only like 3/4 of an inch tall. So I appreciate both the dedication to accuracy and the willingness to accept that there are limitations in what a toy maker can reasonably do. And yeah, there you go. Want to do next slide? Okay, Hadrosauridae. So this is the group that is often confused for the iguanodons. You can tell they look very similar. They are in fact related. They're both ornithopods. These guys become the dominant herbivores, like macrofaunal herbivores, in the northern hemisphere by the end of the Cretaceous. They are the big guys doing all the chomping on the plants. One of the big things that you can tell they're not Iguanodontians anymore is they don't have that thumb spike. And actually, I think only our Equijubis is displaying this, but we actually recently found some quote-unquote mummified hadrosaur forelimb elements. And one of the things that we discovered is that they had a big old hoof thing on one toe on the forelimbs, which is weird, and no one was expecting that. But now, granted, this is only from one species. However, that dramatic of an unexpected anatomical feature seems unlikely to have been restricted to that one species. It was most likely either family-wide or at least related genera probably had a similar arrangement. So at their height, these guys could be, elephant scale or larger. So we have things like Edmontosaurus Necktens, which is in the Hell Creek Formation, and it was a rival in size for T-Rex, is the kind of thing we're talking about here. Like, this is not a small animal. We also find them as far north as Alaska, with the organism that has sometimes been called Iguanodon, but might also just be Edmontosaurus. That's still a sort of up in the air thing as far as I know as to whether or not Iguanodon is sufficiently well defined to be considered its own taxon. And yeah, they also have interesting jaws, which I don't think we have a picture of, but they, as very derived ornithischian dinosaurs, had these really complicated dental batteries and a very complicated jaw arrangement of muscles and how the jaw's bone slotted into the skull that made it so that the jaw could make a sort of back and forth sawing motion. Mammals chew by moving their jaws a bit side to side, but dinosaurs couldn't do that because of the way that their jaws were arranged. But because of how the jaw articulates in animals like Hadrosaurs, they have this back and forth sawing that allows them to grind plant matter between their teeth, which didn't occur in a single row. Instead, they occurred in a battery. So very, very efficient herbivores. And also, we've actually found some with gut contents that also included mollusk shells. So one of the things, I think we've talked about it before on this channel, Jackson, but the things that we think of as herbivores were perfectly willing to eat meat on occasion, and carnivores usually didn't restrict themselves to only meat. And so, if you want to go find videos of horses and cows eating other animals, it's not hard to do. Quote-unquote herbivores are very rarely strictly plant-based in terms of their dietary intake. I think that's it for me on this slide. Jackson, what do you think?
Sounds good to me.
Nice. Hadrosauridae. So this is the actual family of the hadrosaurs before we're doing Hadrosauridae, which is a wider group. Hadrosauridae is one of the things that you see a lot with them is these crests. So it's not entirely clear what the crests were for. They did connect to the nasal cavity and nasal sinuses. So one of the more common ideas is that they were used as resonating chambers, different shapes giving characteristic sounds, which were then used either for species identification or mating calls or something like that, maybe just long-distance communication. It's not entirely clear. It might not ever be known. I believe I have heard some people who've done things like computer simulations of like the acoustic qualities of what these crests could produce, but also they could just be display structures that coincidentally happened to grow from an area of the skull that meant that they contained a connection to the sinus, not actually used specifically for making sound. But I think that's less likely. And even if it were the case that they did not evolve specifically as resonating chambers, they would have functioned as such anyway, because it would be hard to prevent them, given that they have those connections to the nasal passages. So, but yeah, as you can see, Myosauria, which is not by far not the largest, and Cricaridontosaurus are already getting to be very tall animals. 3 meters tall for Cricaridontosaurus, and rather impressive animals. I think people tend to underestimate how big they were, and they tend to overestimate how big some other things are. Like, I think if you ask the average person, like, hey, is Cricaridontosaurus or Ceratosaurus bigger? And you just showed them pictures, they'd probably pick Ceratosaurus. That's not true. Not true at all. So, yeah, I think I'm good there.
We have an event in here in Shreveport called Jurassic Quest, where I believe it's like a moving event. So they do Dallas, and they come here, and then they keep going. And they have the sculptures of dinosaurs that they have. They have a whole bunch of them, and they're like life-sized. So you get to see a life-size sculpture of Tyrannosaurus and a life-size Edmontosaurus. And you compare these to like Pachycephalosaurus, and it's kind of mind-boggling to like compare these organisms in size, because you see them in books and you're like, okay, I can kind of guess how big that is, and then you see it in person.
You were wrong.
Yeah, they have like one sauropod, because sauropods are freaking huge. It's difficult to express how large some sauropods were.
Yeah, there's a museum I used to go to every once in a while, and they had a Camarasaurus skeletal mount.
Mm-hmm.
Camarasaurus is one of the smaller sauropods, and it's still an enormous mount.
Yes. Yeah, I can't even imagine something like Amphicoelius, which wasn't estimated to be like well over 100 feet long.
Yeah, or like a
Dreadnoughtus.
Yeah, like just it's hard to imagine how an animal that big can even exist, honestly.
Yeah.
Which, to be fair, has a whole bunch of nonsense about them. Like, there's still a guy who's trying to peddle that they were so big that they had to live in swamps. That's still a thing that we're contending with.
I believe Darren H did like a whole talk where he dismantled those talking points.
Oh yeah,
because they are Garbo.
Oh yeah,
they're absolute Garbo.
And the guy who's founding this, whose name I don't even remember, and even if I did, I probably wouldn't name him. Just to not draw attention to him.
It's not David Peters for once.
Yeah, this time it's not David Peters. Even David Peters is like, nah, they probably lived on land. So this guy is not exactly like a professional biologist or paleontologist or anything. He's a guy who wrote a book.
He's a dude, just a dude like you and me.
I could write a book too, saying that, I don't know, sauropods lived in outer space. Why not? I mean, technically Earth is in outer space. Everything's technically in space, right? Every show you've ever watched was a space show.
That definitely reforms the lines around what genres are. So.
Actually, I told my friend that once. She was like, I don't like space shows. I go, what show are you watching? I'm like, yeah, that takes place in space. What do you mean? Earth is in space. Take that. Yeah, she didn't seem to think it was as amusing a point as I did.
Yeah, I can understand how that might not go over too well.
But I think we can go on to the next slide.
Yes.
Ankylosauria. So everyone knows Ankylosauria because they're the guys with the clubs on their tails. Except, are they? Sometimes, but sometimes no. So we have Nodosaurus, which is a Nodosaurine ankylosaurid. And only the ankylosaurs actually have the bone club, which is a formation that is basically made up of a bunch of fused vertebrae and caudal ribs. One thing to point out is that mammals are kind of weird in only having a very restricted range for their ribs. The basal condition for tetrapods is to basically have a rib for every single vertebra, including in the neck and the tail. So, yeah. And ankylosaurids, I mean, obviously they were heavily armored for protection against predation, and many of them had big shoulder spikes and neck spikes and tail spikes, and some of them had clubs, and they were essentially walking tanks. One of the things that is not really being communicated in these pictures is how wide they were. From the top, they looked kind of like circles. They were extremely wide because they were using their gigantic guts for fermentation. So they would go around browsing on low vegetation and just digesting that vegetation probably for hours. It's sort of like the people sometimes are surprised by the big pot bellies that gorillas have sometimes. It's because they're also doing fermentation digestion on a smaller scale. But yeah, ankylosaurs are, I think they're kind of charismatic. I mean, look, having a whole bunch of spikes and whatnot is really cool. And one of the things that's odd to me is in pop culture, when people design monsters, they always give like carnivores all these horns and spikes and armor plates and stuff. But you look at actual real world carnivores, and other than claws and teeth, they're usually not exactly full of spiky bits. But who is often the herbivores. So pro tip, if you're trying to come up with an alien or fantasy setting, give your herbivores fearsome weapons. That's really where the money is, as far as I'm concerned. I want to see your fantasy cow analogs full of spikes. But these guys also did make it to the end of the Cretaceous. They are in the same broader group as Stegosauroids, I guess. That is the Thyreophora, which means the armor bearer. The characteristic trait of Thyreophora is, in fact, these armored scutes. In Stegosaurs, they become back spikes and tail spikes and sometimes shoulder spikes. In Ankylosauria, they tend to remain a bit more basal in terms of just being armor plates most of the time, but some of them are derived into spikes like you see in Nodosaurus. And we actually have a pretty good fossil record for transitional Thyreophorans. So some of our first Thyreophorans, like Scutellosaurus and things like that, are relatively basal-looking ornithischians. They're running around on 2 feet instead of 4. And they just happen to have a few rows of scutes. And then as time goes on into the Jurassic, they get more and more heavily armored. And then by the time you get to the Cretaceous, we have the last holdouts of Thyreophora in the Ankylosauria. And Jackson, you have anything you want to add to that?
If you guys haven't seen the PBS Eons video, The Dinosaur That Was Buried at Sea, you should. It's
absolutely.
All about an ankylosaur. Very fascinating.
It's one of our best preserved dinosaur fossils ever. It's, I mean, it's still permineralized, but like, if you don't weigh it, you might be excused for thinking that it's basically the original tissue. If you do weigh it, then you'll realize that no, it's solid rock. But yeah, let's get the next slide, I think, Peter. Okay, Ceratopsia. So this is actually a pretty big group, and most people think of Ceratopsia in terms of the Neoceratopsians, like Triceratops or Styracosaurus. But especially early in the Cretaceous, there were a whole lot more groups. So we have the Psittacosaurus. Actually, interestingly, other than Microceratops, I believe every single one of these animals has a family named after it, which is also interesting because there's one group who likes to pretend that there's this separate ancestry for groups arbitrarily at the family level. And yeah, look at the series of animals we have from Psittacosaurus to Leptoceratops to Protoceratops, which is then very easy to transition into, Neoceratopsia. That's a very smooth gradation. And in fact, I would say that among the best transitional fossil sequences in the entire fossil record is the Ceratopsians. Now, these are ornithischian dinosaurs. You can see some little brushy tail bits on that Psittacosaurus. Those were actually found in the fossil, and they are structurally similar to stage 1 protofeathers, which is probably what they were. It's one of the reasons we think that protofeathers probably go back to the common ancestor of all dinosaurs. Also interesting is that the coloration that you see on the Psittacosaurus model is in fact based on preserved skin melanosomes from an excellent specimen from China, which is illegally outside of China, and there is currently a schedule for returning it to China. I don't think it's currently there, but it is scheduled for return because it was illegally removed from the country, because China has very strict rules about what can be done with fossils from there. And basically it comes down to, unless the Chinese government loans it, it can't leave the country. That being said, there is a gigantic black market in fossils in China, because quite frankly, if you're a impoverished rural farmer in China and you can sell a fossil for the equivalent of a few $1,000s, that's probably more than you were going to make that year anyway. So yeah, you're going to do it. And can I blame those farmers for doing that? No, I cannot. Yeah. Let's see, a few other interesting things. Ceratopsians have a unique bone. So they have what's called a rostral bone, which is the bone that forms the tip of the top beak, and it actually goes in between what is in them a paired set of prebaxillae bones on either side. And so anything with a rostral bone, you can be guaranteed that's a ceratopsian, because they are the only group of animals that have that, and it actually opposes with the predentary bone, which is a bone unique to ornithischian dinosaurs. So only ornithischians have a predentary bone, which is used to support the bottom tip of the beak. And then in ceratopsians, you get a unique bone at the top to support that part of the beak, which is kind of bizarre on both ends. So, Jackson, you got anything on ceratopsians that you want to cover?
That sounds good to me.
All right, let's get our next slide, which I think is still ceratopsians. Yeah. Okay, so now we're getting into Neoceratopsia. This is the sort of classic ceratopsians that people think of. We have Triceratops, Diabloceratops, Chasmosaurus. These are sort of the big-bodied, sort of bison-like herbivores of Eastern Asia and North America during the Cretaceous. Interestingly, they actually originated in Eastern Asia. The earliest, most basal ceratopsians that you get are from places like China, Mongolia, Korea. All of those places have relatively basal ceratopsian fossils that we know of. And then we're not actually sure how many times they invaded what's now North America. At the time, it's Laramidia, because at the time that they start entering what's now North America, it's split in two. So you have Appalachia on the east and Laramidia on the west, with the Western Interior Seaway as a shallow sea in between them, which is why ceratopsian fossils, you don't find them east of the Mississippi. You seem to only find them west of the Mississippi, because it doesn't look like any of them ever actually crossed the Western Interior Seaway, which is understandable since it was infested with things like giant lizards that would eat you. Not the most hospitable kind of thing to cross. So these guys, while they don't reach the same sizes as the Hadrosaurus, or Hadrosaurids, I guess, sorry, they do get to be very large. You can often get them to be similar in size to a small elephant. Some people seem to think that like Triceratops is about as big as a horse. No, it's much bigger than even any cow you ever met. Interestingly enough, it is similar in size to one particular bison species, Bison latifrons, which is a North American species from the Pleistocene, I believe. Am I getting that right there, Jackson?
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me.
Now, the reason that's interesting is that the first find of a Triceratops was of horn elements, and it was actually misidentified as Bison latifrons, a trend which may still continue to this day. We're not sure.
Although we have good reason to suspect.
Yes, we do have good reasons that in certain cases people have mistaken Bison latifrons elements for Triceratops horridus. Interesting also, in the Evolution 101 series that I did with Jackson here on his channel, it's also mirrored on mine. We went over the fact that the two species of Triceratops, Triceratops horridus and T. prorsus, probably form chronospecies. Chronospecies are species that are given a different name because they have significantly different morphology, but they probably represent the same lineage at different points in time. Ceratopsians are divided into two subfamilies, and also there has been some controversy as to whether or not the classic Triceratops is in fact the same thing as Tarposaurus, and Tarposaurus might simply be the adult form of Triceratops, which would actually mean that Tarposaurus isn't a real taxon because Triceratops would have precedence. This is not currently well supported. Most workers in the field do not think that there is sufficient evidence to remove Tarposaurus. Similar to sauropods, also, people tend to get ceratopsian feet really badly wrong. This Diabloceratops has pretty good feet, though. So basically, actually, now we won't go back a slide, but dinosaurs, basically, the basal condition for dinosaurs is that their palms face each other, which creates a weird sort of problem when dinosaurs become quadrupeds, because all dinosaurs have biped ancestors. And the thing is, they don't really gain the ability to turn their wrists, so they tend to be walking in a somewhat sideways fashion compared to, say, the way that mammals hold their forelimbs. And that's why you get on these ceratopsians that you can see, where if you look at the right manus of Diabloceratops, you get those two little fingers are just kind of curling around the back and are stubby and don't really even touch the ground. That's because you're trying to shove these sort of inward-facing palms into a position where they're going to be weight-bearing, and it comes out as weird feet. And yes, I have been told to have a thing for dinosaur feet, and I do have a thing for making sure they're accurate because they are often neglected. Feet are important for getting an animal right. They're an important part of its lifestyle and anatomy. You should take the time to study dinosaur foot anatomy if you want to reconstruct dinosaurs. I'm looking at you, basically every video game maker that has ever included a sauropod or a ceratopsian in one of your video games. But yeah, I think that's it for me on this slide. Jackson, you got anything?
Diabloceratops is cool.
It is. Yeah, actually, I suggested to someone a few days ago that perhaps it is cooler than Triceratops, and I was shot down, and I still think that I was right about that, even though it is a very subjective thing.
I think you're right. I'm in agreement with you on that one.
All right, so, okay. So, we have the Wilson et al. Evolution of frills in Centrosaurians. That's one of the two main subfamilies. We have Centrosaurians and Chasmosaurians in terms of Neoceratopsia. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about this, but it is one of the nice things about Ceratopsia and Ceratopsians in general is that we can actually make these very, very detailed and very well supported clitic analyses because we have such great fossils of so many species for such a long time. And so it is easier to do these kinds of studies with them than basically any other Mesozoic fauna. It's hard to come up with a group of Mesozoic fauna that have a better fossil record than the Ceratopsians.
Yeah, I tossed this in here because this is like, not directly like species to species, but pretty darn close. I mean, just look at that. Look at how smooth the transition is from like Styracosaurus on the bottom to Pachycephalosaurus at the top. It is. We have every like needed transition in that chain, basically.
Yeah, it makes claims about separate ancestry within Ceratopsia kind of laughable. It's like, guys, if you want, but the thing is, they're not modern animals, so no one cares.
Right, yeah.
So,
still cool.
Oh yeah, let's go on to the next. Pachycephalosauria. Okay, so Pachycephalosauria is the other group of what's called Marginocephalia, into which the Ceratopsians also fall. These guys are characterized by having sort of like frill horns, but not having the same kind of big frill that you get on Ceratopsians. They also stayed bipeds. They did not develop a rostral bone. And down at the bottom, we have a whole bunch of Pachycephalosaurus. You see, Dracorex, Stygimoloch, there we go, are both junior synonyms of Pachycephalosaurus because rather than being separate species, this is actually an ontogenetic sequence. That means that these are just different life stages of the same animal with the adult at the far right, which is why anytime anyone says that their favorite dinosaur is Dracorex or Stygimoloch or anything like that, feel free to let them know that there is no such dinosaur. And that is, in fact, just a baby Pachycephalosaurus.
You just say, "Oh, I love Pachycephalosaurus too. It's my favorite."
Yeah, you can say that too.
And they're
That
like,
works
"Wait,
too.
what?"
Yeah. I actually had someone invite me to watch a live stream that they were on, and I was like, and it involved Stygimoloch as a taxon, and I'm like, if I go watch this, do I have to pretend that Stygimoloch is a real thing? It's like, no. Like, all right, because I don't want to do that, because it's not. You will still find mounts labeled as Stygimoloch or Draco Rex in museums, mostly because museums, I mean, they have a limited budget. They can't update every single time something new is found out. And actually, it took a while for this identification of these as ontogenic stages to become accepted, because one of the weird things is that it involves the shrinking of horns. So if you look at Draco Rex, well, what's labeled Draco Rex, into Stygimoloch, and you imagine growing from one into the other, you can actually see that the horns grow, which is what you would expect. But then when you get to Pachycephalosaurus, which is the proper name for all of these, you'll see that the horns have actually shrunk, and we don't actually have any animals that do that now. Like, that's a weird thing. And for that reason, for a while, Pachycephalosaurus, like that idea that these were ontogenic stages was looked at as suspect for that reason. But at this point, the evidence is pretty overwhelming. We have a pretty smooth sequence of ontogenic stages between them, to the point that it's unlikely to represent a smooth transition in terms of phylogeny.
I have a question.
All animals are in the same place at the same time. Go ahead.
So, are they? Do we know that they are getting smaller, and not just that like the cranium is getting thicker and is covering them more?
From what I understand, the answer to that is yes. They are not
Okay.
simply changing in proportional size. They are actually shrinking.
Okay, gotcha.
That being said, look, this is... I didn't just read the paper or anything. So, like, and by just, I mean, like, recently. So, saying with a little bit of a grain of salt, double check. I'm not always right about these things. But we also have one Anosaurus, which is a more basal Pachycephalosaur. It's actually not that diverse of a group, unlike the Ceratopsians, where we just have, just dozens and dozens of these guys of different taxa. Pachycephalosaurids are a relatively species poor group, and I don't really have an answer as to why that is. They ended up filling a niche in places like North America that's kind of like deer. They were sort of a mid-size herbivore. Exactly what they actually used the big dome for is unclear. It used to be thought they ran them together, sort of like rams, which, hence the name. But that is not currently as much in favor, because while the dome is big and thick, it also seems to not be terribly strong. It's very like hollow on the inside. It's not a big, thick, solid thing of bone, and so it doesn't seem like it could actually withstand all that much force. So maybe it was just a display structure. We're not really sure. Of course, to be fair, anytime a paleontologist finds a structure that they can't really explain, display structure is always sort of one of the explanations. Like, maybe it was for display, which, to be fair, a lot of otherwise useless things on animals are for display. But also, do be aware that saying display is usually sort of like the waste bin explanation. We're like, I don't have anything else, so I just say display. Yeah, it's sort of like the default answer for why does animal A have weird anatomy. I think that's all I have for Pachycephalosauria. Jackson, do you have anything you want to add?
Sounds good to me.
Oh, one thing is, sometimes we get people saying that like Draco Rex is proof that dragons are based on dinosaurs. Look at a fully grown Pachycephalosaurus, and you tell me if you think that's going to inspire anyone to talk about dragons. I don't think so. Okay, so this is the group which I don't actually know what to do with the B here, because I think it might actually be Spanish, in which case it should probably be a Velosauridae, but I don't know if anyone says it that way, so I'm going to go with a Velosauridae. This is another southern hemisphere group of, in this case, theropods. In fact, only recently was the first mainland African Velosaurid found, and by recently I mean I think like 3 or 4 years ago. But they are otherwise common in South America and Madagascar. They are characteristically very tiny armed, although we have the relatively basal Myotragus. There we go. See, even I don't get these very easily. And this group, it sort of like takes the T-Rex idea, where you're going to have a big head and tiny little arms, to an extreme. By the time you get to things like Scorpiometer and Pterosaurus, these arms really only can move at the shoulder joint, and we're not even sure how much they can move at that point. The fingers and the elbows were just immobile blocks of bone. In fact, in some later forms, the radius and ulna are so reduced that I have seen people make them for carpal bones and say that they just didn't have a radius and ulna, which is not true. They did have a radius and an ulna, but when they're about the same size and shape as your carpal bones, I mean, this is a very reduced limb. Abelisaurs also seem to have been built for speed. So if you look at the size of their shins compared to the size of their femurs, you see they're fairly long. So it looks like many of them were pursuit predators that would simply chase prey down after perhaps getting an ambush. We're not sure. But they do not seem to have been terribly maneuverable, which is actually sort of a problem for dinosaurs in general. They're not very flexible, which means they're not very maneuverable, but it also means that they are relatively resistant to injury, because flexibility, as you increase in flexibility, your susceptibility to injury tends to go up. So, like we've said before, in evolution, no one gets to be Superman. You don't get to be impervious to injury and be able to turn on a dime and be able to run really fast and you gotta have trade-offs. One thing that is characteristic of Abelisaura as a whole is they have very rugose nasal bones. That means that their nasal bones tend to be very they look like they're covered in scales, or very bumpy. Which is, if you're looking at a big boxy theropod skull and it's got a rugose nasal bone, very good chance you're looking at an Abelisaur. Which I think is all I have for this slide, Jackson.
I was trying to look up one thing that just occurred to me, and I had to see if I was. Yes, okay. Speaking of rugose, there is actually an Abelisaur named Rugops.
Yes, actually. Rugops is, in fact, the African Abelisaur, the one and only. I've also had someone tell me that maybe Rugops is actually just a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, which, given that it's from Africa and not North America, and given that it is in no way looks like a Tyrannosaurid skull, and it looks very much like an Abelisaur skull, I pressed very hard on that X button to doubt that one, and I came to the conclusion that there's no way to think that Rugops is a juvenile Tyrannosaurus unless you just don't know what a Tyrannosaurus or an Abelisaur is.
What was this what was the reason for that person saying that?
They were skeptical of the mainstream conclusion about Abelisaurids.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
This, by the way, is someone who claims to be getting a master's in some kind of biology-related field.
Okay. Interesting. Alrighty.
Yeah.
I don't have anything about these guys. They're weird. They're related to actually, they're relatives.
They're related to me. Yeah. So they're in Ceratosauroidea, which is a large group that includes Ceratosaurus from the Jurassic. One of the things that Ceratosauroidea seems to have in common is the presence of scutes. So you can see in Scorpiovenator, those little black dots. Those actually represent bone-covered scales. And if you look at my avatar, you will also see a series of bone-covered scales. And this is because we actually do have skin impressions from a fairly wide taxonomic range of Ceratosauroids. And yeah, they tend to have scutes running along, which is actually one of the odd instances of some kind of armor plating on a predator, like we were talking about before. Although exactly how good that would have been at actually protecting from injury, given how small they were and how widely spaced, who knows? So there you go. Spinosauridae, which includes, of course, the famous Spinosaurus, but also many other things like Suchomimus, Baryonyx. Early branching members of Carnosauria that only lasted from the early Cretaceous to the early late Cretaceous. This is true. They had a relatively short time frame in which they existed. They existed primarily in Europe and northern Africa, and they seem to have been adapted to life in near rivers or other wetlands like swamps. And they seem to have been primarily piscivorous. The reason we say that is because their teeth tend to be very long and conical, and their snouts tend to be very narrow. And that is a combination that you see often in animals that primarily prey on fish. A great modern example might be the Indian gharial or the Austronesian false gharial, which are both crocodilians that have a similar lifestyle. And they both also have extremely narrow snouts with long, sharp, relatively simple conical teeth. Baryonyx means heavy claw because it, like Suchomimus, it's actually easier to see in the Suchomimus, but that digit 1 claw is particularly large. It's not entirely clear why that is, but it was a common feature shared by a lot of Spinosaurids. Oddly enough, despite the fact that Spinosaurus gives the family its name, it's actually not a very typical member. It is much larger than most other members of the family, and most other members of the family did not have big sails, and we don't know if they had paddle-like tails like we know Spinosaurus had, which is something we've only learned recently. So the other ones might have, but it's not clear. So Spinosaurus is, it's kind of like with Stegosauridae, right? The animal that gives the family its name is actually not a very representative member of the family. We tend to give the family names to the weirdos. But let's see. According to Jurassic World, Baryonyx is apparently immune to lava. Because
Nice.
some lava falls on a Baryonyx head and it just keeps on going. I mean, it doesn't seem to enjoy the experience, but
Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember that. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like it's a mild annoyance. I'm like, man, you can't just have lava drop on your head and be okay.
Yeah, it's like he treated it like it was like scalding water or something. Like, ow, that hurt. Anyway.
Yeah. Right, let's continue chasing these humans instead of screaming in agony and running for your life. It's actually one of my pet peeves when dinosaurs are portrayed as monsters and not as animals, because these were animals, right? They weren't like evil, bloodthirsty killers who don't have any thought for their own life, nor were they immune to like bullet fire. Like if Jurassic World were more realistic, it really wouldn't be that big of a deal because you could kill most of these animals with, a rifle.
Also, funny enough, I've said that the thing that I appreciated about the first Jurassic World, not the second, and obviously the third also, because it's going to be just another monster movie. But the thing that really separated the first Jurassic World from the original Jurassic Park was in Jurassic Park, with the exception of like the very first dinosaur scene and the Triceratops scene, they're essentially always monsters.
Mhm.
But Jurassic World, they were just animals. Relatively late into the movie,
Yeah.
until the Indominus escaped, then it became just a monster movie.
But to be fair, Indominus wasn't actually just a dinosaur. It
was a monster.
It was a created monster, which I think is, I like that aspect where it's like,
Sure.
yeah, the monster in both the first and the second one wasn't just an animal. It was intentionally created to be monstrous. Because it really is the case, right? Sure, dinosaurs, if they were around today, things like Spinosaurus or Tyrannosaurus, they would be dangerous animals, but they'd be dangerous in the same way that tigers or grizzly bears are dangerous.
Right.
As a general rule, tigers and grizzly bears aren't trying to find humans to go kill them, and they're not like, brushing off nearly fatal injuries in order to pursue some random human to eat them. Like,
I think the number of people who die from bears in the U.S. is like in the double digits, isn't it?
I don't know, honestly.
It's not that many, and also
it's certainly not.
Sharks kill certainly fewer than 100 people per year.
Oh yeah.
So it's like the idea that these are all bloodthirsty creatures just waiting for us to stray ever so slightly from suburbia. It's just ridiculous. You're literally more likely to die like taking a selfie or falling out of bed than you are to be killed by like bears.
Bathtubs kill hundreds of people.
Right.
Bathtubs are death traps. Although I will say, I do have a relative who has lived in a place where the polar bears do actively hunt humans.
Well, I would not live there for one.
Well, yeah, nor I. Apparently, the polar bears would wait between cars in the parking lot to ambush people.
That's a yikes from me, dog.
Yeah, it is illegal to be outside alone or unarmed. You have to be both armed and accompanied by another human in order to go outside.
Is this like northern Canada or something like that?
Alaska.
Alaska, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. As someone who works at an aquarium where we have a touch tank for stingrays. One thing that I frequently hear from people is, "Didn't this kill Steve Irwin?" And
Well, not
the thing
this
is, no, actually, we couldn't find the one who actually killed Steve Irwin. We would have him. We just, he couldn't make time for us. Anyways, the thing is, according to the interwebs, only 17 people in recorded history have been killed by stingrays.
Really?
It is extraordinarily unlikely for you to be killed by a stingray. Like, if you do almost anything, if you go down the stairs on a daily basis, you are more likely to die from going down the stairs, right, than driving a car, flying on an airplane, crossing a bridge, whatever. Literally, almost anything you are more likely to be killed by than a stingray. So I just want to throw that out there.
I did not know it was so vanishingly rare. That's weird.
Yeah, this is like less than one person per century since Jesus. Think about that,
Gee.
Yeah, no, it's very unlikely. I mean,
Well, this confirms my relative lack of fear about stingrays as being reasonable. So
I'm not saying
good.
Like screw with them. They can still hurt you, but like it's
as a rule,
it's
don't
very
screw
unlikely.
with wildlife.
Very true. Very true. Yeah.
There's no one's going to benefit from that. You're not really going to benefit. They're not. At most, you're going to put yourself at risk, or you could just needlessly harm wildlife. Like, look at wildlife from a distance, unless you absolutely have to get a closer interaction. Like, if you're trying to get like a scorpion out of your house, fine, okay, great. You're going to have to interact with that thing. But like, if it's out in the wild, don't go poke it. Don't touch it. Don't try to catch it. Just leave it be.
I also want to highlight. Here's a comment from Jack of Hearts. About 22 people are killed by cows every year in the U.S. alone. So yeah, just think about that. Cows alone, way more likely to kill you than a stingray is.
Yep.
So very unfortunate name, but anyway.
Hey, cows can be dangerous. Those are big animals, and they can move fast when they want to.
And many of them have big horns. So yeah,
it's true. They are pecorans, which I think we'll get to probably next time. Pecora.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't remember. It's been a while since I looked at these slides. You and me both, buddy.
Well, hey, I think I'm doing pretty well for basically not knowing what's coming next and then just going off the cuff about groups of dinosaurs.
I mean, that's what we've both, kind of been doing that for this whole series. Like, for anybody watching, like, I made these slides a long time ago, like months and months ago. Last year, I'm pretty sure it was. And I had not looked at these slides in a while, and then got the idea because with the school, semester and work and everything, I was like, I don't really have time to put out content as regularly as I used to, which wasn't regular anyways. But so I was like, well, we'll just go over this. We both know, collectively enough about this material that we can pretty much just wing it and, say a lot of stuff, basically.
And we do.
Yep. As evidenced by the fact that we've had like 6 2-hour episodes. So
basically. Yeah. But I think we should probably go to the next slide.
Yes.
All right. Cacardontosauridae, one of the more difficult to say dinosaur groups. So Cacardontosauridae is a very diverse group. They are the last of the Allosauroids, as it says right there in a little thing I almost missed. Allosauroidea is sort of the other side of Tetanura, which is the so-called stiff-tailed theropods to which most theropods that you've ever heard of belong. Interestingly enough, not the Ceratosaurids. But if you name any theropod, unless it's a Ceratosaurid, it's probably going to be a Tetanurian. Cricaridontosauridae is more closely related, as we said, to the Allosaurus than it is to, say, T-Rex, which is over in Carnosauria. And on the one hand, there's some extremely gigantic, like Acrocanthosaurus, and Giganotosaurus is a Carcharodontosaur, isn't it?
I believe you are correct.
I believe so too. So basically, Cacardontosauridae it roughly means shark-toothed. Part of the reason for that is they have particularly robust, sharp, serrated teeth. And while many of them were heavily built, like Acrocanthosaurus or Giganotosaurus, or even, as shown, Xiaoliang, which is relatively small for a major theropod, but it's still very stocky. We do have some sort of more gracile forms like concave venador or irritator, which, fun fact, irritator is named irritator because it was a really big pain in the butt to excavate it. And so the person who described and named it was so sick of that he just named the dinosaur Irritator because it was an irritating dinosaur to unearth.
Nice.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite dinosaur names.
Drinker is another like really weird one because it's just named after Edward Drinker Coate, but it's not even like Drinkeria or something. It's just Drinker. That's it.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, technically speaking, there's no rule about. There are very few rules about what you can and can't name things. It can't be a previous genus name when you name a new genus, and you can't name it after yourself. But other than that, there are basically no rules. So I once joked that technically there's no rule against naming a new species, and if you can name the genus too, you can just name the genus your and the species mom, and then now have an animal called your mom. Technically,
Han
there's no
Solo
rule
is a
about this.
thing.
Yeah. There are like 6 or 7 different species named after Obama in various ways. So, yeah, naming of organisms is it's actually a bit more Wild West than people seem to think it is, because a lot of times people talk about like the rules about naming things, and there are rules, but when you're coming up with a new one, actually it turns out there are almost no rules. So Cacardontosauridae, they they aren't prominent all the way to the end of the Cretaceous. By the very end of the Cretaceous, they're largely displaced by various Coelurosaurs and Abelisaurs, but they are important predators in sort of a what might otherwise be the middle Cretaceous, if such a thing existed. It does not. And that's largely because of a weird bias in terms of what rocks are still around. The period of time that would be the Cretaceous is almost entirely absent, and so the Cretaceous is just chopped in half rather than chopped into thirds like most periods. But I don't actually have a whole lot more to say about Cacardontosauridae. Jackson?
Sounds good to me.
All right, let's move on. Rise of the Coelurosauridae. Hey, what did I just say? I did not know the slide was coming up next.
Allegedly.
I really didn't. I think I've seen these slides once, and it was when you first sent them to me like months ago.
I was just kidding.
So Coelurosauridae diversifies in the early Cretaceous. This is true. Well, okay. So it originates in the Jurassic, right? And there is some radiation there, but it's not until the early Cretaceous that they really start becoming very significant parts of many ecosystems. Carcharodontosaurs became the top theropods in Asia and North America, such as Shaoqinglong and Acrocanthosaurus, respectively. Yep, the Middle Cretaceous extinction displaced. Jackson, it's like I already talked about this slide. The Middle Cretaceous extinction displaced Carcharodontosaurs and allowed Tyrannosaurus to become the dominant in North Hemisphere. This is very true. We have, well, like I said, we have things like Acrocanthosaurus in the same areas that we now find in the late Cretaceous. We find evidence of Tyrannosaurid remains. Now, one thing is, I have had someone tell me that it is incorrect to say that Tyrannosaurus was primarily a northern Laramidian species, because we have Tyrannosaurid teeth found in places like Texas. And here's the problem. On its own, those teeth are not sufficient to diagnose Tyrannosaurus. So did Tyrannosaurus live in what's now Texas? Maybe. But if it didn't, something similar to it did, but we can't say for certain that it did. However, what we can say is it does mean that Tyrannosaurines, were all across Laramidia. Abelisaurids, Spinosaurus, and other Cacardontosaurids were restricted almost entirely to the southern hemisphere by the late Cretaceous. Also true. Less true for Spinosaurids, whose primary stronghold was often Europe and North Africa, as we discussed, but still, even there, they didn't have a great time through the middle of the Cretaceous. One thing is, it's not super clear what the cause of the mid-Cretaceous extinction is. It's not a major extinction the same way like the end Cretaceous or like the Great Dying, or even the end Triassic extinction. It's significant, and you do notice a significant changeover in fauna, but like I said, because those rocks are mostly non-existent, most of the rocks from that time period have just worn away, or there just wasn't as much deposition in some cases. So it's hard to get a lot of information out of this section right in the middle of the Cretaceous, which is unfortunate because obviously significant things were happening. We just don't know what. But I think we can go on to the next slide unless, Jackson, you have anything?
I forgot to mention earlier that like the common ancestor for like Spinosaurus and the other theropods is like Jurassic, and yet there are no Jurassic Spinosaurids yet that we know of. So
yeah, presumably
prediction
their ancestors are, yeah.
Prediction for the future. Ooh.
Mm-hmm. So that is one of the interesting things about the fossil record is we always get our first representatives of a group after they would have initially evolved, because when you first find something, obviously it had ancestors. So when we say, Spinosaurids are from the Cretaceous, it means currently known Spinosaurids are from the early Cretaceous primarily, but they obviously would have had to exist, at least their ancestors, earlier than that, and we just don't have the fossils for them. And that's even true when you get to the like really fossil records, like for the Ceratopsians, right? It's still the case that every Ceratopsian we found probably wasn't the first ever of its kind, because that isn't even really a thing. So, yeah. It's a bit weird about the fossil record, and so you have to keep that in mind when you're talking about when things existed, is that when we find their fossils is not the same as exactly when they existed. But I think we can go on to the next slide, but we also have a super chat, which I don't know if you want to read that, Jackson.
Oh, hold on one second. I'm trying to.
Jackson's
Peter, how do
having
we put it up?
Up on the screen right now.
No, I mean, how did you do that, Peter? I can't.
Peter's good at this.
What the heck? Okay. Sorry, I can't participate in the live chat this week. Scheduled my stream at the same time. We'll catch the rerun over on Dapper's channel. Thank you, Vandalia, 1998, for $5. We very much appreciate you. And have fun.
Yeah, it seems like you have a pretty interesting show schedule.
Yeah.
So, Tyrannosauridae. It is a wide group of animals starting in the Jurassic with things like Monolophosaurus and Guanlong and Dailong. And then they become very big and the apex predators of many ecosystems by the end of the Cretaceous. They do make it all the way to the end of the Cretaceous, and they might be, or they contain at least, the most studied taxon of Mesozoic dinosaur by a pretty big margin, which is Tyrannosaurus Rex. Tyrannosaurus Rex is probably the most studied Mesozoic animal, period. And so they start off relatively small. We have Dilator, which is definitely shorter than you. And they also start off with fairly robust arms, which is interesting because they don't stay very robustly armed. And so when they start out as relatively basal Silurisaurians like Long and Dailong and Monolophosaurus, they are fairly generalized predators. They're probably preying on relatively small things like things the size of like ground fowl. So they're probably not eating much that's much bigger than like, a big chicken or something. Now, of course, these wouldn't actually be chickens. These would be things that are related to birds mostly and mammals and whatnot, but not actually chickens. But we see this tendency in a lot of lineages of Tyrannosauridae to heavily emphasize the use of the feet and the mouth in predation over the hands. And so their hands tend to become less and less robust over time. They go from characteristically 3 fingers to very often 2 fingers. And also, there are people who are in favor of making Tarposaurus Tyrannosaurus. There are people who argue that there is not sufficient distinction to warrant a new genus for Tarposaurus, and suggest that Tarposaurus bataar should be redesignated and referred to the genus Tyrannosaurus, making it Tyrannosaurus bataar. I have actually seen Tyrannosaurus bataar on some museum displays, but currently that is not really the consensus view. So, and interestingly, this is another group where we actually have some pretty nice transitions. So we can go from Dailong, which is a very basal Silurisaur, to Guanlong, which is now becoming a little bit more derived. You're getting more of that sort characteristic Tyrannosauroidean skull shape with the strong nasal bone and the reinforced anterior of the skull. And then we get into Tyrannosaurus, where that tendency in the skull to become more and more robust and stronger has increased. Size has increased, which is a trend that we see in Tyrannosauroidea. And then, finally we get to Tarposaurus, which is a characteristic late Cretaceous Tyrannosaurid. Interestingly, the other subfamily in Tyrannosauridae is the Albertosaurine, and they are similar, but there are some differences, which we might cover if we have another slide on Tyrannosauroidea. So let's find out if we do. No, we don't. So Albertosaurians were a bit more gracile and smaller.
You get nothing.
You didn't even put Tyrannosaurus up there.
You know what? Everyone already knew him. He's way overhyped. We need some other Tyrannosaurs in here. Tyrannosauroids. Sorry.
Okay, but like Gorgosaurus, Libratus, Albertosaurus.
I can't put every dinosaur in this slide. We never get done. We've been doing the Mesozoic for like 3 episodes now.
It's because it's the best part.
I mean, fair enough. But anyway.
Okay. Ornithomimosauria. We have Dinocuris, which is not as closely related as Pelecanomymus and Struthiomimus are to each other. It's sort of off on its own little branch there. But we also have Struthiomimus, which means ostrich mimic, which looks far more like an ostrich than Struthiosaurus did. I would say immeasurably so. We have a very charismatic Pelecanomymus with a wonderfully reconstructed head. I love that thing. And Dinocuris. These are theropods. They are coelurosaurs, so they're more closely related to birds than the Tyrannosauroideans are, although they're still pretty distant. But they convergently started to look a lot like certain ground birds, like ostriches and emus, who themselves are in fact theropods. And they also converge with a beaked mouth and no teeth. So Ornithomimosauria really do look a lot like birds. And they had similar lifestyles probably to things like ostriches and emus. So they were large-ish, ground herbivores primarily. They probably would, eat the occasional little lizard or mammal or proto-mammal. But they were mostly eating plants. And they were very well adapted to speed. That's probably how they evaded their predators. But when we get to Dinocuris, we're actually starting to get into more megafaunal niches and the ability to fight off, intimidate away predators rather than relying on speed. And you get that with the increasing claw size. Although the claws were also probably used to do things like grab at trees and pull them down to be within reach of the mouth, things like that. So I think we'll move on to the next one unless Jackson has something.
Sounds good to me.
Therazinosaurus. Okay. So we have Pachycephalosaurus, which is one of the basalmost Therazinosaurs. We have Neomongosaurus, which is a bit more derived. And then we have Therazinosaurus itself, which, interestingly enough, was originally identified as a species of turtle.
Turtles for the win.
Yeah, the reason for this is that the unguals, which are the distalmost phalanges that are the core of the claws, were thought to perhaps be similar to the unguals of certain long-clawed turtles, like I think it's alligator snapping turtles have very long claws like that. And so it was originally thought to actually be a gigantic turtle, which is, I don't know, I just find it amusing. And the reason for this is that for a long time, the only part of their anatomy that was known was, in fact, the claws. And that's why Therazinosaurus, the type species, is Therazinosaurus cheloniformes, which means turtle-shaped. So it was called, Therazinosaurus means scythe lizard, or lizard of the scythe, and cheloniformes means in the form of turtle, even though if you look at it, it's not very turtle-like, but the claws were. It's not entirely clear exactly what was done with these gigantic claws. Defense is an obvious option, but also, like I said, gathering food may in fact be another option. These were large coelurosaurs, about as closely related to birds as ornithomimosaurids, and they were also beaked, and I believe largely toothless. I think some of the more basal ones might have had teeth, but I don't remember exactly. Also, interestingly enough, some later forms, like Neoceratopsia and Therazinosaurus itself, actually walked on all four toes. In most theropods, the digit 1 is a dew claw. It doesn't touch the ground. It doesn't really have much to do with, well, anything. But we have some actual four-toed, all four toes bearing weight Therizinosaurs, which is weird, and also makes them more like Godzilla, which is cool. Because most incarnations of Godzilla have four toes. So, if Godzilla's a dinosaur, probably a Therizinosaur, not a T-Rex. Although he doesn't look much like either, but whatever. I think that's all I have for this one.
So, the reason that I picked... how'd you pronounce the bottom right? Was it Bapalsaurus?
I went with Bapalsaurus, but I don't actually have a... Yeah.
Oh well. At any rate, so the reason I picked a skeletal reconstruction, these illustrations need scale bars from PC Myers. Actually...
Bapalsaurus has one?
It has... what does that say? Like 20-something centimeters?
Yeah, I think that's what it says.
So, little guy. Little gee. You're right, though. You're right. Sorry.
Well, maybe the previous ones did have like scale grids.
Some of them do. There's one artist for the Corythosaurus picture. The guy who does those always puts scale bars on his pictures, and they're very good. They're all really well done. You also
often get the standard 1.8 human male figure.
Right. Yeah. So the reason I chose Bapalsaurus is if you look at the pubis and ischium, so his like pelvic bones that are sticking down. So unfortunately, with this illustration, or this illustration reconstruction, whatever, the pubis, which is the part of the pelvic bone that points forward under the hip in the Saurischians, the lizard hip dinosaurs, it points forward, like lizards, hence why they're named. Whereas in Ornithischians, the ischium and pubis both point backwards, like in birds. But so as you get further and further through the Coelurosaurs, closer and closer to the birds, that pubis, like the one that's in front, starts pointing or moving ever so slowly backwards. And so in this image, rather than pointing forward, like in the earlier theropods, it's like sort of in line with the femur in this image. So it's kind of halfway back instead of forward, like it was in the more basal theropods. And so just something I thought was kind of neat. You get that gradual moving backwards of the hip.
And interestingly, I believe Jackson has this roughly arranged in terms of from most distant to closest to modern birds, which means we're going to see that arrangement become more and more bird-like.
Yeah. But that was all. I just want to point that out.
Okay, Oviraptorosauria. So Oviraptorosauria is a unfortunately named group because basically it means egg thief lizards. And it was so named because the first Oviraptor remains were found in association with dinosaur nests and eggs. And so the initial idea was that these were eggs that the Oviraptor was stealing. However, later finds actually included Oviraptors and related animals brooding over those nests. And so we now realize that, in fact, rather than being primarily egg thieves, they were in fact devoted and careful parents. Now, that being said, would an Oviraptor eat an egg? Almost certainly. Very few animals pass up a free egg, right? It's full of protein and fat. It's a really good calorie source. So, I mean, yes, I'm sure that Oviraptors ate eggs at some point, but they were not particular egg thieves in some special way. Interestingly enough, this Oviraptor actually is displaying brooding behavior that we actually have found in fossils. And one of the reasons that we know that these animals had big feathery wings like this that look very much like modern bird wings is that the position that they had their arms in only would have covered the eggs if they had such integumentary structures. If they were just naked or scaly dinosaurs, as you might see, in Disney's Dinosaur, which does in fact have an oviraptor in it, that position wouldn't actually have covered the eggs, and so it would have been a useless brooding position. And so this is one of the reasons that we think that feathers, one of their earliest purposes was actually thermoregulation, not only of the animal itself, but also of the animal's offspring while they were in the egg. So we also have Ceratopsians and Kuduptrix. Kuduptrix is interesting because it was actually enigmatic exactly where to put it for quite a while. One of the reasons for that is that it's a relatively basal oviraptorosaur, and it doesn't have the sort of characteristic head crest that comes up from the nasal area of oviraptorosaurs like Ceratopsians or Oviraptor does, or Anzu also has that. They're also a fairly widespread group. You can find them all across Eastern Asia and Laramidia, which again is the western portion of North America. They have a similar sort of pattern. There's a whole bunch of animals that basically crossed over from areas like Mongolia and China into Laramidia over the course of the Cretaceous. And that is because those areas were connected. And to this day, there's actually some interesting connections between North American fauna and Chinese fauna. For instance, there are giant salamanders in only two places in the world, China and North America. The same is true for alligators. The only two species in the subfamily Alligatorini within Alligatoridae are in, one is in the North America, and one is in the Yangtze River Valley in China. So that odd connection remains to this day. And of course, those are animals that got to where they are now in the Mesozoic. So yeah, it's an interesting little tidbit that you can actually see these ancient connections to between China and North America in some of the longest lasting members of the faunal assemblages of both continents. Jackson, we're also at another point where we're getting beaked theropods here. So as we keep going here, we're actually, interestingly enough, before we get to birds, we're going to lose the beaks as far as characteristics. So it seems like beaks evolved several times independently in Coelurosauria, probably 3 or 4 times, but it's not entirely clear. Jackson, you have anything?
Nope, sounds good to me.
All right. Wait, am I gatekeeping for bad dino artists?
What?
I don't know. Brad Stevens says, don't listen to Dapper. He's gatekeeping for bad dino artists. I'm not even sure what that means.
I don't know.
Troodontidae. So now we're getting to Dinana Kasorio, which is basically the sister group to aves. Well, to like avialans, right? So basically the things closer to modern crown birds than Deinonychosaurus are usually called birds in sort of the like literature for public consumption, right? For non-experts. Trodontosauria, one of the ways you can tell that they're in Deinonychosauria is that they have that characteristic hypertrophy digit 2 ungule, which is the big raptor claw that you see there. It's very obvious in the Jianyulong and the Baryonyx illustrations. These are generally relatively small-bodied, gracile dinosaurs. However, we do know of at least one large troodontosaurid, which is the so far unnamed Alaskan troodontid, which we only have teeth for, but they are relatively enormous. And troodontosaurs have a characteristic tooth shape where they have these very prominent bump-like serrations on both the anterior and the posterior sides of the tooth. They're very characteristic. If you see them, it's very hard to mistake them for anything else if you're familiar with them at all. And these animals probably looked very much like a bird. In fact, this Baryonyx illustration, I'm not a huge fan because it does not bother to have quill knobs, or quills, I suppose, on the digit 2, whereas we know that, in fact, by this point, as we're getting closer and closer to birds, digit 2 primaries, essentially, are more or less ubiquitous. We have quill knobs on digit 2 from more than one member of Deinonychosauria. We also have preserved actual like whole wings for Deinonychosaurus. So if you are, in fact, drawing any Deinonychosaur, put feathers coming from its digit 2. It's not that hard to do, guys. You can do it. I have faith in you. This Genuong is really good at that. The May, I don't know. It's a little thin on the coating. One thing that's true for modern birds and was probably true for Dinana Kasoros is the contour feathers create a much thicker silhouette, say, than you would get without them. If you Google featherless owl, you will see just how small and scrawny the actual body of an owl is compared to how big and poofy it is based on just feathers. Brainbug asks if they taste like pheasant. I mean, they probably would have tasted more like pheasant than they would have like, say, a cow. But I actually don't. There's no way to assess that. But unless Jackson has something, next slide.
Sounds good to me.
So this is the other group of Dinana Kasorio. And one of the things you can see here in both Changuraptor and Microraptor is, in fact, those digit 2 primaries. So Microraptorinae is a subfamily within Dromaeosauridae, and most of them seem to have been able to at least glide. And interestingly, they also have flight feathers on their hind legs, which is something that was hypothesized as an ancestral trait for birds and their relatives. The reason for this is that even before these animals were discovered, it was noticed that some birds, domesticated birds, had a mutation that caused feathers to grow on their feet instead of scales. And interestingly, the feathers that grew were asymmetrical and looked like flight feathers. And so it was proposed that a hypothetical animal that was called, hypothetically, Tetrapteryx may have represented the ancestral condition for birds. And we have found this anatomy in the close relative of birds in Microraptorinae. We also have Halscorapter, which was originally reported as being sort of a duck-like dromaeosaurid, but later work has brought into question just how aquatic Halscoraptor really was. But you also get several different body sizes. Unlike Tyrannosauridae, the body size of dromaeosaurids tend to go down through geological time. So our biggest dromaeosaurids, which still aren't always that big, tend to be earlier, and then later ones tend to be smaller. The largest known was Utahraptor, which is about the same size as the animals called Velociraptor in Jurassic Park. However, the body shape of those animals in Jurassic Park was based on Dinocuris, because the author whose name is escaping me, who wrote Jurassic Park, Jackson, help me.
Michael Crichton.
There it is. Because Michael Crichton had basically read a book that suggested that Deinonychus was simply a fully grown velociraptor. That's not true. That is not the case. Velociraptor was instead a much smaller animal. I actually have a 1-to-1 scale replica of a velociraptor skull, and it is, I mean, it's much, much smaller than you would expect. It's about the size of like a dachshund skull. Like, it's really not that big. But yeah, unless Jackson has something, we'll go on. I think everyone recognizes dromaeosaurids as the classic raptors of movie fame.
The smallest boy. The smallest boys.
Well, like I said, some of them were big.
The medium-sized boys.
So yeah, Aviale is the group that is where we start at things that people can reasonably start calling birds. Now, bird is a colloquial term. It doesn't have a strict scientific definition. So, there's aves, there's aviale, there's all these, there's ornithurae. But aviale is where we probably get flight evolving in the sense that, like, it evolves in this group and it is retained all the way until today in flighted birds. And members of aviale that are flightless are secondarily flightless. We have Enantiornis, and I believe also Confuciusornis were also an enantiornithine bird. These were relatively early avialans, and they were interesting in that the arrangement of muscles that we used to pull the wings up and down were sort of reversed. Modern birds have a weird pulley system where the upstroke muscles actually are attached to the bottom of the sternum, and they have a weird pulley-like system where down on that, and that raises the wing. Iguanodontians didn't do that. We also get some of the invasion of avialans into some of the niches that they characteristically dominate in today, such as Hesperornis or Ichthyornis, which were basically shorebirds. Hesperornis having a lifestyle similar to like a grebe or a loon, and Ichthyornis having a lifestyle more like a gull or something like that. Also, interestingly, we are at a point where birds don't always have beaks, and they usually still have teeth. And their wing fingers are usually unfused at this point. So these are still very much animals. Oh, and they also usually still have bony tails. Not always. Picostylia is, in fact, a clade within Aviale, and that's where you actually get the picostyle, which is a condensation of a few caudal vertebrae into one big sort of clubby-looking thing that supports the tail feathers, the tail fan, if you will. Modern birds actually cannot make enamel. So while, as we have from Brian Stevens, a link to embryonic chickens that can be induced to grow dentin structures from their jaws, they actually lack the functioning genes to make enamel. And so if those chickens were allowed to come to term, their teeth would just be bare dentin. Sounds horrible. So I'm glad that they're not allowed to come to term, because dentin is the part of your tooth that hurts when you have a toothache, and bare dentin as an adult animal sounds like torture.
Yes, it does.
So, yeah. Unless you have anything, Jackson, we'll continue on.
I think Hesperornis was like 5 feet long, wasn't it? Something like that. It was a pretty large bird.
It was large. I don't have the actual number like in my head. Sorry.
Oh, fair enough. Next slide.
Mammals. Okay. So first, mammals, probably crown mammalia comes about in the Cretaceous. It seems like the divergence time for a lot of animals that are in mammalia is sometime in the Cretaceous. For instance, Boreoeutheria, which is the group that includes humans and mice and horses and dogs, probably diverged in the late Cretaceous. The divergence between, like, say, placental and marsupials probably happened in the early Cretaceous, maybe. It's a little hard to tell because, we have to rely on mostly molecular clocks, because a lot of the things that help characterize these animals today are harder to detect in relatively basal organisms, because they all tend to have a sort of broad shrew-like anatomy, like you get in, to some extent, in Simulestes, and certainly in Leucotherium. But we do know that there were some relatively large mammals and mammal relatives, like Teniolebus and Rapinomamus, which were big enough to eat at least small dinosaurs and be, not relegated to scurrying around in the shadows of the night while the dinosaurs were safely asleep. These were, pretty significantly sized animals, to the size of basically medium-sized dogs is the maximum size that we're finding mammals, but still most of them are very, very small. We're still getting mostly shrew and, like maybe rat-sized for most of our mammals. But this is when lots of things that we think of as characteristically mammal-like probably evolved. For instance, you'll see that all of these are reconstructed with external pinnae for the ears. That is probably something that does not go much farther back than crown mammalia. Modern monotremes don't have pinnae, but there is some fossil evidence that their ancestors may have, and it was secondarily lost in modern lineages. So it looks like external pinnae probably goes at least back to crown mammalia, but hard to say exactly. But it's also where things like nipples evolve, because while most modern mammals have nipples, including marsupials and placentals, monotremes do not, and it doesn't look like it's ancestral. It doesn't look like they lost that. Instead, they have what's called a milk patch that is homologous to the milk lines of therian mammals, which is the marsupials plus placentals. And so it seems like the common ancestor of therian mammals had specialized milk glands that led to nipples, but this was not just broadly the case for mammals. So if you go too far back in time, that just stops being a characteristic that's common in mammals. And a lot of the things that we think of as just like, this is just how mammals do it, actually doesn't actually go that far back in mammal evolution once you are like in the Mesozoic. So I think we can do another slide unless Jackson has something.
Yeah. So there was one weird sort of otter-like mammal in the mammalia form in the Jurassic called Castoricata, which is kind of cool. That name Castor refers to like beavers, and he had this weird sort of paddle tail. But also, and we'll discuss this again when we get into the Cenozoic, but like the like Cymolestids are not. I mean, they're I believe they're true mammals, but there were a side branch that went extinct. But these guys actually straggled into the early Paleocene, into the early Cenozoic, like into the Paleocene, and so the mammals, as they were radiating in the Cenozoic, it wasn't just the monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians. There were other Mesozoic holdovers that they were still competing with, interestingly.
Now, remind me, did mammals originate in the Eocene, Jackson?
No, they did not.
Okay, so if someone were to tell you that they did, that guy would not know what he's talking about, right?
Not only that, if someone were to use that phrase, I would say they are probably lying to you. I find it really hard to believe that they would know what the Eocene is, and honestly believe
also
that
think
mammals,
that that's what mammals do.
Yeah, like there's no way. There just is no way. Also, the paper that guy who said that phrase worked on in which that quote originated is an invertebrate paleontologist, so he should definitely know better.
Not his specialty, but still adjacent enough that you should probably know that mammals
bonkers.
Don't originate in the Eocene.
Certain
modern mammal groups do originate in the Eocene. That's true.
Yeah, I believe the earliest crown mammal is Frutofossil, or at least one of the earliest, and that was late Jurassic, very like tail end Jurassic. So the idea that they originated in the period that lasted from 56 to 34 million years ago, when they're actually kicking around like 150 million years ago, is not right. That's what we what's the term for that? Wrong, I think is the word.
We call that wrong. Guys, in case you guys aren't aware, we're not making this as like a response
weird
to
hypothetical,
but like, well, I mean this series, right? Like this is a series where we're not mentioning particular like pseudoscience people and responding to their claims directly, but every once in a while it comes up, and we'll just point out how crazy and bonkers some of the claims that are out there regarding paleontology are.
Oh, I mean, yeah, there are. So, I think it's reasonable to say that like Microraptor, is something of a transitional form, right? It showed while not phylogenetically transitional between like stem and crown birds or something like that. I mean, it sort of is, I guess, depending on how you define that term. But regardless, like
stem within Avialae includes Pterosaurs.
Right. Yeah. So within Avialae, for instance. So Microraptor is a full-blooded dromaeosaur, so it nests outside of Avialae. But in terms of its morphology and ecology, it's doing what like primitive avialans would have been doing, right?
Yes, I agree.
And so I would say that's a transitional fossil. And there are people who just say like, no, there are no transitional birds. Birds just appear. But what does that even mean? None of the avialans that we discussed, on the previous slide, are within modern aves. None of them. Yeah. Not a single one. They all have teeth, and some of them have long bony tails. So that's definitely transitional, at least in my book. And same with
transitional in any way that you're going to define transitional in a way that makes it possible to identify anything as such.
Right, exactly. And I would say these guys are like, they're transitional between, at least I think like the Cymolestids are between like the marsupials and eutherians. So again, you could say like they're transitional, right, between the earlier, proto-eutherians and the true eutherians. So we've this whole series has just been about like looking at different fossils and their ecology and all this sort of stuff to give you a picture of how much we really know about the past and how not not just a guess, it's not an assumption. We really do know a whole lot about the past, and even that's not really that much compared to what we still need to know about the past.
Right. Yeah, we have in some ways we know an astounding amount about the ancient past.
Mm-hmm.
But in other ways, there's still so much left that we may never even learn.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, we'll simply never learn.
Jack of Hearts wants me to pull out the Futurama clip. Unfortunately, I can't.
Which one? Oh, the
Dr. Banjo.
Dr. Banjo. Yeah. Do you know the colorful origins of the name Castroids? No, I don't. No, I do not, Brainbug. Also, why are you not a moderator? Sorry about that. So here you go.
The name Castroides means like a beaver.
Oh, fair enough. For anyone who does not know the Dr. Banjo clip, was it Dr. Farnsworth and
yes,
Dr. Banjo, who's an orangutan. He's a creationist orangutan.
Yeah,
and they're arguing because Farnsworth is like, oh, there are no transitional fossils between apes and humans, and then Farnsworth
that was Banjo's.
Or sorry, Banjo is arguing there are no fossils between apes and humans, and Farnsworth is like, no, look at this, here's Homo erectus, and Banjo says, nope, you've got another gap here, and then Farnsworth is like, oh, but there's Australopithecus, and then they go back and forth like this for what is presumed to be like hours, and you've got this long, this long.
You've got a line of like a dozen so different fossil taxa going between basal Miocene apes and humans, and then finally, Banjo's like, aha, I have you now. Where is the supposed link between these apes and this Sahelanthropus chilensis?
Right.
And so Farnsworth like, oh, you've got me there. That one link is still missing, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. To which Dr. Banjo just says, ha, things don't exist simply because you believe in them. Thus saith the almighty creature in the sky.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so it's right. So that's we really do have things like that in paleontology. So to give you like just a little like live example of that, or an actual real world example, so there was like Eusthenopteron and Ichthyostega, and for a while that was like all that was known of the fish to tetrapod transition. And then Acanthostega was found on, so you have like Eusthenopteron, Ichthyostega, Acanthostega, and then Pandorictes was found. So you have Ichthyostega, Eusthenopteron, Pandorictes, Ichthyostega, Acanthostega, and then Tiktaalik was found. So then it's Eusthenopteron, Pandorictes, Tiktaalik, Ichthyostega, Acanthostega, and now we have Parmastega, which is between Tiktaalik and Ichthyostega. And of course,
that also sounds like an Italian dish.
It does, yeah. I'll have the Parmastega with meatballs. I don't know. And so, and that's not even all of them. Like, look at a phylogeny of the fish to tetrapod transition. It's densely populated with fossils, most of whom you've probably never heard of because they really don't get a lot of fanfare. Like, nobody really cares about Gogonasus. I'm sorry. Just nobody ever talks about it. Or any of the other little guys like Osteolepis.
Sad fish noises.
Sad flopping, yeah. These little like fish, which are more derived or more closely related to us than lungfish, but they're just all fossils, right? And you have this amazing series where you can see like the cranial bone transition and transition in the vertebrae and the fins and everything, and they get basically no mention by like creationists who talk about the fish tetrapod transition. They're like, oh, they got 3 maybe 4 fossils and they rest their whole case on those. Like, nope. Nope, that's just a lie. Sorry. So same is true of like the transitional like stem arthropods. We get more stem arthropods every year, so it's just ridiculous to hear people say, oh, there were just arthropods that came out of nowhere. Like, nope, that's a lie. Sorry. Game over. Try again. There are actually 2 more slides, I believe.
Well, let's do it.
Well, as the producer, I did want to interrupt and to clarify a little bit because Jackson, earlier you said those are transitional forms, at least in my book. You will have to specify the book since we're doing a book on your channel.
The rocks are there. Volumes 1 and 2.
Yeah, but so you're doing a series on one of your books in which it might not be a transitional fossil. So yes.
Yeah, I honestly, because like I said, it's been so long since I read this book. I know they talk about human fossils later on, and maybe it'd probably be a good idea to have you on, Dapper, or like Erica or somebody to talk about that. There is a chapter on what does the fossil record show, and I'm almost certain it's going to be terrible garbage. But at any rate, next slide, please.
People should tune in for that.
People absolutely should tune in for that as we read that. So,
well, here's where it all comes crashing down. The Mesozoic was pretty great. I remember it well. However, it did end with one of the biggest disasters in Earth's history in terms of the extinction of organisms. Not the biggest. It certainly is not as serious as, say, the Great Dying at the end of the Permian. However, it is probably second to that. A meteor called the Chicxulub impactor hit the Earth in what is currently the Gulf of Mexico, over by as we can see here, the Yucatan Peninsula, about 66 million years ago. Now, people still often say 65 million years ago, and I usually don't call them on it, but it is, in fact, closer to 66. That was a fairly recent refinement of the dates there. Sometimes we close in on basically shrink error bars, and sometimes that the near round number will change a little bit. So it is 66, not 65, but again, it's not that big of a deal as far as I'm concerned. Hit the Yucatan Peninsula, ending the Cretaceous and leaving a global iridium layer, shock quartz, and tektites. So these are all things that are unusual things on Earth. Earth, one, doesn't have a lot of iridium, and shock quartz and tektites are the direct result of extremely high energy, high pressure events. They do not normally form under regular conditions. There have been some suggestions that this iridium layer may in fact have been the result of large-scale global volcanism. However, we've looked and seen how much iridium do volcanoes put out, and while it is more than you would expect normally without a volcanic eruption, it's still an order of magnitude too low to explain the iridium layer at the KPG boundary. And also, we just have so much evidence of an asteroid impact. Not that there wasn't more volcanism than there is at the end of the Cretaceous. There certainly was, but it's simply not even close to enough. This meteor wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, Mosasaurus, Plesiosaurs, Pterosaurs, and ammonites, as well as other groups, and it took a toll on even the groups that weren't wiped out. In fact, you could kind of define bird as just the dinosaurs that didn't get wiped out. It's not like there was one lineage that escaped of birds that escaped into the from the Cretaceous into the Eocene. It was quite a few lineages. It's that those are now the ancestors of what we call birds. And yeah, it's a pretty big deal. It caused tsunamis all the way across Laramidia, parts of South America, presumably in Eastern Africa. We actually have at least one fossil site that was directly caused by the impact. It has a bunch of tsunamite, and it has fish with meteor ejecta embedded in their flesh like they got shot by a shotgun.
Cough, cough, next slide.
Oh, okay, let's go to the next slide then. There we go. Fish with microtektites embedded in their gills, which come from the KPG meteor. Yeah, a really bad day to be alive on Earth in general. The China site in North Dakota is a fossil site where animals killed just hours after the KPG meteor struck the Yucatan. Yeah. There have recently been reports of a dinosaur that is supposed to have been killed by this event, which wouldn't, as far as I know, make it the first dinosaur that we can identify as having been killed directly. However, that cause of death has been challenged, as things often are. Science preliminary results are always very much subject to revision.
I haven't even seen the paper on that. Have you?
Actually, I don't know if I have. I think the announcement actually hit before the paper did, which is never a good sign.
That's like the third or fourth time that De Palma's group has done that. So
Yeah.
they've been putting out red flags since like 2019.
Yeah, it's. I'm hopeful that is what this is, because that would be really cool. However, if I were a betting man or a betting dinosaur or whatever, I might not bet on that. Actually, interestingly, I have been known to place bets, and I will not bet on that. So there you go.
Also, where's PZ? We got scale bars now.
I know, right? He leaves just in time for all the scale bars.
I finally have a picture with a scale bar. Oh well.
Two,
yeah.
So one thing is, I have in fact heard someone say that the Chicxulub impactor is the cause of literally all Mesozoic fossils, or at least that mainstream science thinks that this impact is the direct cause of all Mesozoic fossils. This is not true. As far as I know, literally no one advocates for the idea that all dinosaur fossils were killed by the Chicxulub impactor. In fact, essentially none were killed that we have as fossils. It is a ludicrous straw man, and I don't know why anyone would ever come up with it, but I do know someone who did. You can see that stuff on my channel. It's bonkers.
Yeah, that was quite a claim. It's up there with what is it? Fungi or peripherans? That's another.
Yep. That was another fun one. Yep.
Yeah, I mean the things that we hear people say when they say silly things about evolution and prehistory are just astounding. I don't know if you saw, there was a video recently that was on Orange Channel, and he asked me to look at it before he finished the script or whatever. And there's a claim by these silly people that Mesozoics did not exist.
I remember that. They're just fantasy creatures made up to explain whale evolution.
Yeah.
No, those are actual animals.
No joke. No joke. Yeah, we have like multiple species, probably a couple dozen specimens at least. But no joke, when I heard that, I paused it, rewound it multiple times. And even after listening to it multiple times, I was like, I just want to clarify. Did she say Mesozoics don't exist? Like, is that a thing she said?
This is invented creatures, not real.
It's very... Now, creationists will often lie about things, but very rarely do I ever hear them say something just didn't exist.
Right, even though it's
like
right
a fossil
there.
Group that we actually already have. Yeah.
Right. See the skeleton?
Yeah, like what I think happened, this is my personal hypothesis, was they read like a page in a textbook, and they show that textbook, and it says like reconstruction of a Mesozoic, and I think they took that to mean that like the ancestor of whales, which someone just decided to call a Mesozoic, this is what they would have looked like if they had existed, which I find baffling, but we've heard crazier claims before. So anyways, which video was that? The one Aaron did recently where he debunked John and Jane talking about the whale transition. Oh yeah, and for Dapper's video about the asteroid claim, an asteroid killed every dinosaur ever.
Yep.
So
which
go
is
check
the
out
actual
both
claim, which similar to Jackson's experience, I had to like do like a triple take to be like, wait, no, that can't be the claim here. Like they're not saying that I'm supposed to think this. I think yes, they are. That is exactly what they're saying.
Which I think is funny because it shows like the difference between our camps. Like I feel like we bend over backwards to like not strawman what they're saying, because what they're saying is just that crazy.
Look, we've come up with even better versions of their arguments that they could be using.
Yeah,
to help out.
Yeah, for anyone, and then we brought it up in a conversation with a creationist because her argument was close enough to that we were like, we've actually joked about this, and you can use it as an argument. what was it? You could argue that like every transition is just a loss.
Yeah.
Like fish to tetrapods. Well, you lost gills, you lost fins, you lost the ability to breathe totally underwater. You know?
Lost that caudal fin,
Yeah,
anal fins. I mean, lots of stuff is gone now.
yeah, that's true. I mean, because for anyone who's unaware, like creationists try to define everything that they do accept as a loss of genetic information or loss of bones or behavior or what have you. So why not just define every transition in terms of loss, and then boom, there you go. They accept everything. So.
I do have a quick. Is this our last slide?
This is the last slide. So,
okay,
and we're coming up on that 2-hour mark. So, Dapper, do you have anything going on your channel?
I do. I mean, I always do, right?
That is true. You're way more active than I am.
Well, first, I want to say I don't know who did this, but someone did. Earlier this week, I received a package from my Amazon wish list containing a monitor for a computer, not the lizard. Just want to make that clear. I did not receive a live lizard from Amazon.
Like a partly venomous lizard from through the mail.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will pass on a offer of a free monitor lizard in the mail. But I want to say thank you to whoever that is if you happen to be watching. It was sent anonymously, and so I imagine you probably don't want to identify yourself in this chat or on my channel later. I do want to say thank you. I'm going to be thanking you again on my channel on Tuesday, which was going to be Matt with Maddie, but Maddie is going to be out of town, so I think it's going to just be a Kent with Bent. On that is going to be the 17th. The 24th should be a Jackson with Jackson.
Yes, I'll be
Jackson,
there.
Do you have a dinner to go to?
No, are
you sure?
I don't think so. As far as I know, I should be there. Everything should be well and good, hunky dory. I don't believe I have any plans on my my little reminder 24th.
Okay.
Nope.
All right. Well, the 19th Thursday is going to be I think it's already scheduled, which is the Jewish Matt Powell episode 2 about Yosef Mizrahi, where he is going to tell us about cold stars, which apparently freeze you if you approach them, which is not how anything works.
Jewish Matt Powell.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, well, basically, he's at least as dumb as Matt Powell, and he's at least as morally troublesome as Matt Powell, shall we say. Yeah.
Yikes.
But he's Jewish, so he's the Jewish Matt Powell. Although Yosef Mizrahi is actually significantly older than Matt Powell, so really Matt Powell is the Gentile Yosef Mizrahi, but whatever.
Right, we got to go with the who came first in terms of taxonomy. So
it's true. In terms of priority, it's more accurate to call the actual Matt Powell Gentile Yosef Mizrahi. That is accurate. But then again, so the other thing is Yosef actually cribs almost all of his stuff from Christian young Earth creationists. So it's not very original. It's not like he's coming up with his own because it says X and Y in the Talmud or the Mishnah or something. I have this new take on biology. No, it's just boringly regurgitated.
That would be interesting, though.
It would be. I was hoping for that actually, but instead he's even citing Christian creationists. He's like, this guy's not even a Jew. I'm like, yeah, but he is a Christian creationist, man.
Right.
He's got basically the same interpretation of the first few chapters of Genesis as you do.
I mean, that's kind of like what Haranyaya did before he went to prison for a millennium.
Was deservedly so.
I mean, yeah, no, absolutely. But he just cited he basically worked in tandem with the Discovery Institute and was it ICR also? I think. I
don't know
on different things, but they just sent him a bunch of their normal products and he disseminated those in.
Yeah, he translated them into Turkish.
Right. So he didn't have any new talking points. It was literally just the same stuff everyone's already heard, just translated into Turkish. So.
And then
so
let's
course,
see that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that gets me to the 24th.
Yes.
I'm hoping that the 26th will actually be another episode of my speculative evolution project. I don't have much more work to do to get one more episode out. I think I need to make 2 more pieces of art and then put all of the stuff on the World Anvil and record it, which together should probably take me until Thursday of next week, and then I should be able to get that video scheduled. If not, it'll just be the third episode of the Jewish Matt Powell, which I don't remember exactly what it's about. It's not as funny as Cold Stars, because my goodness, is that a bonkers thing? Cold Stars. If you get close, they'll freeze you.
That's how heat works, right? I'm pretty sure that's how heat works.
No, it's not at all how heat works. That's why we don't have the cold version of the microwave.
It doesn't like shoot out blasts of cold ray like Mr. Freeze or something, or
no. And the thing is, even in those cases, like if you look at it's like he's like shooting out highly pressurized gases that cool off as they depressurize, and then they transfer heat to them from you via things like, conduction.
That doesn't sound right.
That is how cold works.
That sounds like
actually freeze things that way.
That sounds like a Illuminati conspiracy.
Yeah. So in case people are wondering, if you were in the vacuum of space and there was a cold object near you, you wouldn't be significantly cooled by that, because you would just keep radiating away your black body radiation at essentially the same rate anyway.
Yeah.
The only thing that could happen is if it's blocking something that's hotter than it, and you're in its shadow in a sense, then you would be receiving slightly less radiation from that warmer object. But it's also the case just because you're in the shadow anyway. Like, it's not terribly important how cold that object is. It's not going to be a significant factor in basically any circumstance. So yes, you could get inches away from a extremely cold object in the vacuum space and have no noticeable change in your temperature. It would not matter.
Yeah. Well, that is certainly a claim then, So
yeah, it was a fascinating thing. Also, he seems to think that the Milky Way is inside the solar system.
The Milky Way is inside the solar system.
To the left, specifically, whatever that means.
The left. I love that he's specific enough about it. He can pinpoint where it is.
Yeah, I don't know. Now, some of it might be a translational problem because his first language is Hebrew. Clearly, he's not an excellent English speaker. But still, I have trouble imagining how bad the translation problem could be that it comes out with the Milky Way is inside the solar system and off to the left. That's how the translation comes out.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Oh, my goodness.
But you see why I call him the Jewish Matt Powell, because that's like the air in space. I mean, it's that bad.
I mean, basically. That will be my legacy, I think. Richard Dawkins has his memes. I was right next to I was standing next to the guy who said the air in space. So,
and he's not even a flat earther.
Nope. He's just that dumb.
The sun is a fire. It needs oxygen, guys.
Yeah. Oh, good Lord.
But yeah, that's about as far as I want to look ahead on my channel.
Good stuff. Looking forward to that. The only thing I have coming up is, I guess, eventually the orangutan's tail, the gorilla's tail came out recently, and that will be fun when I get to that. And then we'll start the Cenozoic next Thursday. Probably won't finish it, and maybe we'll finish it the next Thursday. And then after that, we'll be back to reading this wonderful 1960s creationist book, which is every bit as informative and useful as modern creationist books. So there's that. Well, thank you for coming, Dapper, as usual. Thank you for hosting us, Peter, as always.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everybody in the live chat, for watching. Appreciate all of you. And so we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.